In this video, we'll talk about identifying funding sources and thinking about how to secure funding. So something that's important to note here is that in your book, this with Steps of Program Planning, they've placed identifying funding sources down at step 5. In reality, though, when you're developing a program or thinking about developing a program, you really need to know that you're going to have the funds to implement it before you go through all the work of developing materials and then finding out after you develop materials you don't have any funding to implement it. So really what happens in real life is you usually will start with an idea of a program you want to implement or a existing program you want to change, and you'll be looking for possible funding streams or funding sources to be able to carry out that particular project. And once you identify one that you feel like would be interested, an organization that you feel like would be interested in funding your desired program, then you typically will write a proposal or a grant to that particular funding agency to see whether or not they are in agreement with being able to provide you money to carry out your program. So this is why I've put arrows really with step 5 going back to steps 2 and 3, where throughout the process of thinking about this program and writing goals and objectives, you need to be thinking about writing these items in a format that will go into a grant proposal so that you can get funding. Some funding sources you can look at. There are lots of different avenues for funding, and sometimes the agency in which you're working may have funding available. So for instance, if you're working at the WIC clinic, you might be able to, there may be funding opportunities through the state WIC office or the federal WIC office, the national WIC office. They may have money available where you can write a proposal to solicit funds for the program you want to implement, and they already have funds there that you can apply for to carry out some new program. Other times you may be working for an agency where you need to apply for funding externally. So for example, I know some of the individuals who work through the Utah Department of Health have written grants before to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and soliciting funds for a program. Now what happens at the federal level is often they will have a request, what's called a request for proposal. So they'll actually have, maybe they'll have funding available for, that they advertise to individuals, they have funding available for childhood obesity prevention programs. So if you have an idea that is a new idea for implementing some kind of a childhood obesity prevention program, then you could write a grant and try to get funding for your particular organization. And in fact, that's what happens with state health agencies. They often will get federal funding. Sometimes though, if you're at a local health agency, you might be able to apply for, you can apply for federal funding, but you could also apply for state funding, or maybe there's even local foundations that are interested in supporting some kind of a local intervention or program targeting the population you're interested in. And sometimes it'll be mentioned that there could be state or local or national foundations. So things like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is an example where they provide funding. They often do things in the community related to childhood obesity prevention or environmental interventions to address like food insecurity, things like that. There's a Walmart Foundation, so some of the bigger companies may have a foundation associated with it, and they are funding projects that give back to a community setting. You can have other nonprofit organizations. Maybe you're looking at a particular food industry and they're interested in funding a project. Maybe you're interested in increasing dairy consumption within schools or some other community setting. So that affects the public. Maybe you're able to go through like Dairy West or some other, or maybe even something like Yoplait or other companies that sell Chobani, other companies that sell yogurt and other dairy products, and you can see whether or not they'd be interested in funding something in a local community. And then sometimes institutional is you might be at a particular agency where you have internal funds that can be used for projects if you can justify to whoever oversees the money, if you can justify to them the purpose and significance of the project that you'd like to do. So just reiterating that really to get funding, program developers often will write grants. They may have funds that are available for them just to use in program development, but most of the time they're going to be writing grants to secure funding. So this is one of the reasons why in this class, for your community project, you're going to be writing somewhat of a mock grant, but it's based on a real project that you're doing with your community site. But the reason why you're doing it is because this is how projects get funded in real life, and I want you to have experience in being able to know the process of pulling together a grant. So what are the components of a grant? Well, it really depends on the funding agency, so who you're writing to. Sometimes they have very specific parameters on what they want you to answer. But in general, here's some key pieces that usually go into the thought process of writing a grant. So you often will write a section that gives a justification or rationale for the program, and this is considered the needs statement. You'll describe the aims of your program. This is your program goals and objectives. You'll describe how you intend to carry out your program. So all of these things would be in a written format. How you intend to carry out your program, that could be the methods. How will you evaluate the program success? That would be your evaluation plan. How much will your program cost? That's your project budget. How will you accomplish the program in the time frame given the grant funding opportunity? So most grants will tell you that they are funding a project for maybe a year or 2 years. Some could be 3, 5 years. They really outline what time frame they want you to accomplish your program in. So you're really basing your time frame off of whatever is written in the funding opportunity, and that would be your timeline. And then finally, you provide an overview of the entire project and program team. This is a transmittal letter, title page, and project summary. One thing I would say is that when you write a grant proposal, it is written, but oftentimes you may be talking to the person who's responsible for receiving the grant. You may be probably called the program officer or grant funding officer. You're going to be talking with them potentially verbally as well, to pitch kind of your idea and to see if they feel like it fits within the scope of that particular grant. So far in this class, we have talked about program goals and objectives. So that was a separate video. And it also talked about a timeline in one of the previous videos. Now we're going to talk about the rest of these in this video, except for the evaluation plan, because that will be a completely separate topic. That will be next week's class. We'll talk about program evaluation, but all of these others we'll go through now to give you an idea of how you put these together. So writing a needs statement, I'm going to have you do a little activity with this. So I want you to review the needs statement section in figure 19-8 from your textbook. So it's in chapter 19, figure 19-8. And just as you're reviewing that, just glancing through that, I want you to think about this question. What type of information is included in a needs statement? I'll go ahead and set the timer. So hopefully you had a chance to look through that and think of some ideas of what's included in a needs statement. These are just aspects that I pulled out of the needs statement. So I noted that they connected their program to public health initiatives, or they discussed public health initiatives like Healthy People and Dietary Guidelines. They provided some statistics related to foodborne illness. They provided some results from a needs assessment and background information related to their proposed project. And they also included previous research that supported the need or provided justification for a new program. So now I'm gonna have you do a little case scenario. This is based on a project that I'm currently working on. I mentioned it earlier with USU Extension and Dr. Lecheminat. And these are put together a program goal and outcome objectives and giving you a little bit of a program overview. And then I want you to think about how you would outline the needs statement. So I'll give you a minute to read through this information first, and then I'll give you another minute to think about how you might outline the needs statement. Okay, so I'll start that timer again. And now this time, I want you to think about how you would outline the needs statement. Okay, so now I'm going to show you kind of my thoughts on how we might outline the needs statement related to this particular wellness program case scenario. So these are just some ideas. You may have some other ideas as well. So in this case, I think in the needs statement, I would provide some statistics of individuals experiencing homelessness in the US and or Utah, negative health outcomes related to homelessness, any previously published research of dietary or physical activity interventions done among individuals experiencing homelessness, and then describing how the proposed intervention will add to what's already been done and provide justification for conducting the proposed intervention and the approach that we're going to take. And I think too, trying to connect it to Healthy People 2020 or dietary guidelines for Americans can also be advantageous to show that you're trying to help to accomplish some of the nation's goals. So the idea is just providing some background. It's almost like a literature review if you've seen that before, or if you think about a research paper and the introduction section kind of sets up the reasoning for why the researchers conducted the project. A needs statement is really similar to that in providing background information and justification for why you're doing the project that you're proposing. So that finishes our section of the needs statement. Let's move on to methods. So we'll do another activity here. So I want you to review the methods section now that's in that same figure, figure 19-8 from your textbook, and consider this question. What type of information is included in the methods section? This is information in the methods section I picked out. So they describe the design or the components of the program, including the whole lesson plans that they would have as part of the program. They describe measurements that we take in. They describe the questionnaires that they would administer. They outlined all the materials that would be developed and how they'd be developed. And then they identified any statistical tests that they plan to use to analyze the data collected. So now let's take this to the wellness program case scenario. So thinking about this case scenario again, what kinds of things would you include in the methods section in order to provide a description of what is going to occur? So again, what would you describe in the methods section? Okay, so things I thought of that could be described in the methods section based on this wellness program case scenario is the study design being a 10-week intervention that is including pre-post measurements and a 6-month follow-up. We'd want to describe the class curriculum development. In this case, we're using the Create Better Health curriculum from USU Extension, and we're adapting it to meet the needs of the homeless individuals living in the transitional housing units. We would describe our measurement tools, so we'd want to describe how the anthropometrics would be measured, how we plan to measure hand grip strength, how we're going to measure dietary intake. It could be important to provide a rationale for why we're using these measurements and why we chose the measurements we did. And also we want to describe questionnaire development. And in this case, we would want to provide too what our statistical analysis approach would be for the different measurements that we're going to be taking, and over the overall evaluation of the program. We would want to talk about what statistics we're going to use to be able to measure that. And really it relates back to the program objectives. So now we've covered the methods, and I mentioned that we'll talk about evaluation plans in a separate class. So now let's talk about the project budget. So now I want you to review figures 19-11 and 19-13 in your textbook, and I want you to consider these questions. What are direct costs? What are indirect costs? And how does a budget narrative differ from other budget proposals? From your book, looking at an example of a budget. This really is a budget summary. It's itemizing different components of the budget and just giving the total amount that's needed for those components. So you can see direct costs include things like salary and wages. Fringe benefits would be if you have insurance coverage that you need to pay for. And then you've got equipment that you might need. Maybe you need to buy a computer, or maybe you need blood pressure cuff, or maybe need a glucometer, depending on what type of project you're doing. Materials and supplies could include things like maybe you have cooking demos, so you need food. Maybe you have exercise equipment that you want to give participants, so those would be supplies. Maybe you're going to be copying things, that would be underneath this as well. Maybe you're going to be traveling to professional meeting, or maybe you're just traveling to the community site. And so you total all those things are considered direct costs, and you total those up. Indirect costs really are more of the overhead costs, so administration costs for those who receive the grant funding at your agency. There's administrators who are essentially directing the money that's coming in and out of the institution through grant funding. And so you'd have to cover administrative costs for that under indirect costs. Utilities that are used for a facility, those could be indirect costs as well. So, and that usually comes in as a percentage. Now, who determines the percentage? Well, every institution will have a percentage rate of what they require for you to put in as direct costs. Sometimes, though, a funding agency will limit the percentage of that are related to indirect costs. So essentially, you take a percentage of the total direct costs, and that's your indirect cost. Like I said, sometimes this percentage is limited by the funding agency. They may set it at, say that the indirect cost rate cannot be more than 10% or 20%. However, if they don't specify, then you often need to put in the percent of the percent that's agreed upon with your institution. In this example, they're using 23%, and you can see the 23% of the total direct costs is this amount. And then you add the direct costs and indirect costs together, and that gives you the total amount that you're requesting for your grant. And you can see in this case, this was just for year one, so this must have been a 2-year grant, and they're indicating how much money they will need. They'd have to indicate how much money they need for the second year as well. And what I would say is that when you do write real proposals, they often have a cap on how much money you can request. So you need to build your program around those parameters. You don't want to go above the amount that they've said. This is an example of a budget narrative. And hopefully what you saw with the budget narrative is that it essentially describes how you came up with the numbers on this page. So it looks like this Greta grant writer, 17,271. Well, how did you come up with that number? It gives you an outline of how they came up with that and what the responsibilities will be for that person. And the same thing, here with other personnel, you get a sense of where that funding is, those funds are going to go. Here's how the fringe benefits weigh out. And here they've got they describe the equipment that they need and materials and supplies. And this, I didn't have room to put the whole figure on the page, but this is in your textbook. You can take a look at this. So essentially, you're describing how you came up with the numbers on the overall kind of budget summary here. So the last thing we'll talk about in this section is the transmittal letter, title page, and project summary. And these next pages are from your book. This is an example of a transmittal letter. So you can see that it's very short. It's just, you can think about it like a cover page that goes with your proposal to write it to the agency that you're trying to seek funding from, and introducing the grant proposal that you have, and the amount of money that you are asking for, requesting, and then information about the contact person who is the team lead or the project manager on the proposal. The title page really just provides the title. It provides who they're writing the grant to, the proposal and start and end date, how much funds are being requested, the project director, or you think about this as project manager, and where the award should be made. And then this person would be that administrative person at the agency who is overseeing receiving the money from the funding agency. The last part of this is a project summary, or your book calls it an abstract. Essentially, think about this just like you would an abstract of a research article. It summarizes everything that's going to be found in the full document. So in this case, it summarizes the different components in your grant proposal. So you can see it provides a little bit of background information and provides where the previous work that's been done, the purpose of this particular project, how long the project will be, and the budget. So you can see it really encompasses most of the sections that are covered within the actual full proposal. And it is true that sometimes there may be a team of reviewers from the funding agency who are looking at grants. And if they don't have, maybe on that team, there's a few individuals who are assigned to really delve deep into the grant and provide feedback, and others on the team may just read this project summary to get an overview of the project. So this can become very important as well in a grant proposal. So moving back to the steps in program planning, we just finished talking about identifying funding sources and actually applying for funding or securing funding. After this step, once you have written your proposal, secured funding, then you have the ability to implement the program. And with implementation, you are also going to have responsibility to provide feedback to the funding agency on your accomplishments. And we'll get into that more later and thinking about the last step, which is evaluating program elements effectiveness and then disseminating that information. If you have questions on thinking about identifying funding sources or securing funding through grant writing, let me know.